The courtroom used to be a place where truth reigned supreme, where justice was blind and impartial. But what unfolded on that day was nothing short of a mockery, a deliberate humiliation of a man who spent his life defending the rule of law. The judge didn't just preside over a legal proceeding. He orchestrated a public shaming, drenched in arrogance and contempt. Every word, every glance, every smug smirk was a calculated strike against someone who dared to challenge the narrative. It wasn't justice being served. It was vengeance, masquerading as due process. What people witnessed wasn't a fair exchange of arguments or a quest for truth. It was a spectacle. The kind of theater you'd expect in a dictatorship, not a constitutional republic. The judge, cloaked in black robes and self-righteous authority, made a show out of degrading a man who spent his career protecting American citizens. And for what? To send a message. To let every viewer, every citizen watching this unfold, know exactly who holds the power and how little they think of those who speak out. The air in that courtroom was thick with tension. Not the kind that comes from legal uncertainty, but the kind that screams, "You don't belong here." It was clear from the beginning that this wasn't going to be a fair fight. Every interruption, every loaded question, every dismissive scoff was designed to break the spirit. This wasn't about facts. This was about domination, about tearing down a man's reputation in front of his peers, the media, and the American people. He was grilled, ridiculed, and stripped of dignity, not because he broke the law, but because he wouldn't bend the knee, because he spoke too plainly, because he stood firm. That defiance, that refusal to play by their twisted rules, made him a target. The judge knew exactly what he was doing, turning a legal proceeding into a tool of ideological warfare. It was never about justice. It was always about control. There was no need for that smug tone, that passive-aggressive ridicule masquerading as professionalism. Every word dripped with disdain, as if simply disagreeing with the powers that be made someone worthy of scorn. And the courtroom, once a sacred space for truth, became a stage for ridicule. The lines between justice and political theater weren't just blurred, they were erased. People watching from the outside might think this was just another court appearance, but for those paying attention, it was something far more sinister. A warning, a declaration. The elites no longer fear exposure. They flaunt their power, even in broad daylight. The judge didn't just mock the man on trial, he mocked the very idea of accountability. And the worst part, he knew he could get away with it. He knew there'd be no backlash, no consequences, because this is how the system works now. When someone who's spent years defending the country is dragged through the mud simply for standing firm, it sends a chilling message. Not just to him, but to anyone who might dare to do the same. The ruling class has no tolerance for dissent, not even from those who've risked their lives upholding the law. And that's exactly what this moment represented. A turning point. A place where justice was bent to serve an agenda, where courtroom decorum was weaponized, where a man's lifelong service was spat on by those who claimed to uphold the Constitution. And through it all, the smirking judge sat high and mighty, relishing the spectacle. Not once did he try to hide his bias. Not once did he show the restraint his position demands. Because in that courtroom, he wasn't just interpreting the law, he was rewriting it, in real time, for all to see. A man who has stood on the front lines, faced danger most people only see in movies, and made decisions that shaped the security of an entire nation, found himself shackled not because he broke a law, but because he spoke truth that made the powerful uncomfortable. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an unfortunate misunderstanding. This was a deliberate move by a system that's gone completely off the rails, a system that can no longer tolerate those who dare to speak with clarity, authority, and conviction. The Kosh arrest wasn't about criminality. It wasn't about justice. It was about silencing someone who had become too bold, too effective, too real. There's a reason the establishment targets voices like his, because they cut through the noise, because they don't flinch, because they speak to the people in a way that wakes them up. That kind of clarity terrifies those who operate in the shadows, So, what do? They drag him into court, they twist the narrative, and when that doesn't work, they slap the cuffs on him and call it law enforcement. This was a man who had spent his life ensuring the safety and order of a nation, someone whose boots had been on the ground, whose decisions had real-world impact, and now, suddenly, the very country he served turns around and labels him the problem? That's not irony. That's betrayal. That's the system devouring its own protectors, because those protectors have become inconvenient, because their words no longer align with the carefully constructed illusions peddled by the elite. This isn't just about one arrest. It's a blueprint. A signal to every person out there who's thinking about standing up, who's thinking about challenging the machine. It says, if we can do this to him, we can do it to you. The message is clear. No amount of service, no number of commendations, no record of honor will save you if you start telling truths that expose the rot. If you become too loud, too brave, too unfiltered, you become a target. And let's not pretend this was spontaneous. This was planned. This was rehearsed. The court was just the stage. The cuffs were the finale. The entire ordeal was designed not only to punish, but to shame. To paint the picture that the ones speaking truth are the real villains, while those pulling the strings behind the scenes remain untouchable. They want people to see this and think twice before opening their mouths. They want fear, not justice. Obedience, not truth. The mainstream won't tell the story this way. They'll twist it, omit the parts that matter, and pretend this was all just routine. But those paying attention can see the pattern. They've seen it before, and they'll see it again. The ones who serve, who protect, who speak up, are always the ones who end up in the crosshairs. And while the public watches in confusion, the machine grinds on, more ruthless by the day. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a purge, a cleansing of those who refused to bend the knee. And it was done not in the shadows, but in full view. Because they're not afraid anymore. They believe no one will stop them. They believe they can silence anyone, anywhere, anytime. And when someone stands up with backbone, with a voice that can't be bought or bullied, they don't try to refute him. They try to erase him, and they use every tool at their disposal, media, courts, public opinion, to do it. The courtroom has long been seen as the final safeguard of liberty, the place where truth is supposed to stand above politics and where power is checked by principle. But what unfolded in that chamber shattered every illusion. This was not a hearing. It was a carefully scripted takedown. A cold, calculated move where the scales of justice weren't just tipped. They were thrown across the room and replaced with something far more sinister. Raw, unchecked authority disguised in legal robes. From the moment the proceeding began, it was obvious that this was no fair trial. The judge didn't sit there as a neutral arbitrator of the law. He played the part of a hostile interrogator, a man already settled on a verdict long before the gavel ever hit wood. Every comment was laced with condescension. Every question was a trap, not aimed at uncovering facts but at bending a narrative. And that narrative had one goal: discredit, humiliate, and ultimately crush someone who refused to toe the line. The system wasn't looking for truth. It was demanding submission. And when that submission didn't come, when someone dared to speak without fear or filter, the judge didn't just lose patience, he took action. Like a general commanding an army, he used his position not to uphold the law, but to weaponize it. The courtroom became a battlefield, and the man in the crosshairs was marked not for what he'd done, but for what he stood for, his values, his convictions, his refusal to play the game. There was no moment of reflection, no impartial assessment. Instead, what unfolded was a display of judicial dominance, the kind of raw exercise of power that doesn't belong in a democracy. The judge didn't need evidence to make his point. He needed an audience. And he had one. The cameras, the press, the officials in the room, they all watched as the hammer came down, not just on the accused, but on the very idea of independent thought. This was about sending a message, not just to one man, but to everyone watching. It screamed, "Step out of line and this could be you." It wasn't about justice. It was about fear. And fear is exactly what the system thrives on. The moment someone becomes too confident, too articulate, too unwavering in their stance, the mask comes off. The robes stop representing justice and start representing power. And that power is wielded with no mercy. What happened in that courtroom wasn't a debate or a dialogue. It was a declaration of war on dissent. The judge didn't even try to hide it. He used his authority like a weapon, his position like a sword. And in doing so, he transformed what should have been a civil proceeding into an authoritarian spectacle. No transparency, no fairness, just an agenda being forced through the gavel like a battering ram. The terrifying part is how smoothly it all unfolded. Like it was routine. Like it had happened before. The smirks, the dismissive tone, the scripted outrage, they all pointed to a system that no longer believes it needs to pretend. A system so emboldened by its grip on power that it no longer sees the need for subtlety. And in that moment, the courtroom, the very place meant to defend the rights of the individual, became a symbol of how far those rights have eroded. This wasn't just legal overreach. This was ideological warfare. The courtroom wasn't a sanctuary of truth. It was a stage, a trap, and the judge was the executioner, cloaked not in objectivity, but in a cold, calculated hunger to crush those who won't kneel. The most chilling part of what unfolded wasn't the mockery, the arrogance, or even the blatant abuse of authority. It was the unmistakable message sent to the rest of the country. If this can happen to someone who dedicated their life to upholding the law, it can happen to anyone. The display wasn't just meant to punish one man, it was meant to intimidate millions. It was a warning shot, fired in plain view, meant to silence every voice that dares to rise against the creeping authoritarianism, tightening its grip on the nation. The chains that were clamped down weren't just physical, they were psychological. They were designed to plant seeds of doubt and fear in every American watching, to make them question whether speaking out, standing firm, or simply telling the truth is worth the risk anymore. The entire scene was staged with surgical precision, like a play scripted by those who know exactly how to dismantle opposition without drawing too much attention. This wasn't just law enforcement, it was psychological warfare. What's even more terrifying is how normalized it has become. These kinds of actions aren't viewed as extreme anymore. They're accepted, even applauded by those in power and the media machines that echo their narratives. The machinery of the system now runs on fear and compliance, not justice and accountability. And this moment was just another cog in the machine designed to keep the rest of the population in line. The rules are clear: obey, conform, or be crushed. People who once believed that integrity and service offered protection from political retaliation are now seeing the truth. There is no shield when your views don't align with the establishment. The new reality is this: loyalty to the Constitution, to truth, to the American people, means nothing if it conflicts with the agenda of those at the top. And when that conflict arises, you don't get a conversation, you get a courtroom, a gavel, and a cell. The shift has been subtle, but undeniable. Step by step, those who once held positions of respect and authority are being rebranded as threats the moment they refuse to go along. It doesn't matter how many years of service, how many lives they've impacted, or how deep their commitment runs. The minute they step outside the boundaries drawn by the elite, they're no longer celebrated, they're eliminated. And it's done in such a public, humiliating fashion that everyone else gets the message loud and clear. This is how tyranny operates, not through sudden coups or violent overthrows, but through slow, deliberate erosion. Through show trials and public shaming, through the quiet weaponization of institutions that once stood for justice. The courtroom is no longer a place of protection, it's a tool of enforcement for those who want to control the narrative. And the people are catching on. They're realizing that silence isn't neutrality, it's surrender. Every American watching should feel the weight of what happened. Because what's at stake isn't just one individual's fate, it's the fate of everyone who still believes in speaking the truth. If someone can be dragged through the mud for refusing to bow, what chance does the average citizen have? This was never just about one man. It was about creating a culture of fear so thick so oppressive that no one else dares to step out of line. The strategy is simple. Make the consequences of courage so painful, so humiliating, so permanent, that people begin to censor themselves, to stay quiet when they should speak, to look away when they should resist. That's how freedom dies, not with a bang, but with a slow, fearful silence, imposed by those who know exactly how to manufacture it.